Given all the what would be a word, turmoil, discussion going on in regards to George Floyd's death. It might be interesting just to talk a bit about, what I've read some of your comments on Facebook and things. I know me and Phil have had a few discussions around this as well, but just kind of looking at what you think about the sort of Christian response to racism. What is it? What have you perceived that to be, and what should it be? What should it be as well?
Honestly, the world is burning, isn't it? It's just crazy. It's happening. So in New Zealand now, there are demonstrations and people talking about pulling down old statues and whatnot. Obviously, this isn't all because of George Floyd's death, but that was the catalyst that people said, you know what? Let's just bring it all out of the closet now and deal with it. Man. But Christians don't always help themselves in response to these sorts of things, and I try not to push too hard, because there are limits as to what people can hear, and there are limits as to what people can accept, and you should, with some people you do have to take a very gentle, incremental approach, but that's not really me. So I've been not really trolling, but I've been trying to be a bit of a stone in people's shoe, or my fellow Christians' shoe anyway, on this issue lately, because I think that some of them need to hear it in ways that they're not really willing to hear it, and that needs to change. But what I'll do is I'll just bring up one issue, and I'll just focus on that one issue and talk about it, and try to show people that it's reasonable and state it in ways that I think are reasonable. And so the one that I've decided to bring up a lot lately is the whole issue of privilege, and the issue of white privilege. Now, white privilege isn't a special thing. It's just privilege had by white people. And of course, all it really amounts to is the acknowledgement of the fact, and it really is a fact, and I think there's no serious denying that it's a fact, that in developed nations like the United States or Canada or in the UK or New Zealand, where we have an ethnically diverse population, but we definitely have a white majority and a history where the white majority has used, I don't want to talk about it as though it's a collective entity, but where minorities have suffered disadvantages. It is just true that being white bestows upon you certain advantages, and they're often very subtle advantages, but the aggregation of all those advantages put together is what we call white privilege, the privilege of being white. And it'll be, for example, the attitude that law enforcement has to you, the way that people look at you. Two people walking down the street dressed fairly scruffily. One of them is me, well, when I don't have a freshly cut mohawk and I'm looking a bit respectable, and one of them is a young Maori guy. In New Zealand, the Maori people, we don't really have African Americans because we're not America, but that would be an example. They're going to look at us differently, and their expectations about our behavior will be different. And expectations about academic success and the way that we are treated is at multiple levels, in ways that affect our opportunities in life, in long-term ways that are quite drastic. Those differences exist, and that's Can I interject while we're doing this? I'm just thinking, because I'm going to have multiple questions, I think, as you discuss this. So something. So when you mentioned about, you said the Maori and yourself. Now another way to view that would be that at least over here, maybe in somewhere like the US and the UK, is another explanation for that could also be based on classism. So if I'm walking past a white person in a suit, you'll know, as in studying psychology, we have certain heuristics. We work through certain mental health shortcuts that make life livable, in a way. So if I walk past a smart white man in a suit, and I walk past a black person, maybe, or
maybe another ethnic minority, or even a white person, any color of someone, say, in a hoodie, I might, through a sort of using that sort of heuristic, I might engender the belief that that person may be more of a threat than the person in a suit. Even if it could be a black person in the suit, Asian person in the suit, or white person in the suit, they're less of a threat because I have the heuristic based on perhaps personal experience, media, all sorts of things that have shown me that I should be, that the person in a hoodie is more of a threat to my safety than someone in a suit.
Yeah,
it's when you have...
Yeah, that's true. So my example, we were both dressed the same. And absolutely. I mean, white privilege. This is why I don't talk so much about white privilege. I just talk about privilege, because being white isn't the only thing that gives you privilege. Being a good-looking person is, and people overlook how much of a privilege that is. This is it's referred to as hot privilege. It's real. It makes a massive difference. And all we're doing when we talk about white privilege is acknowledging that in the sorts of societies we're talking about, being white is one of those things that gives you privilege. And class as well. So, two black people, obviously from different classes, that's going to make a difference. Two people from apparently the same sort of financial and educational background, one is white, one is black, they will not be treated the same.
And I think if I was to walk around or even drive around in tracksuit trousers and like just a scruffy top, I wouldn't even need to consider, actually, I might be stopped. I'm going to have to make sure my wallet's with me, make sure my insurance and my car's all sorted. But I know for a fact that friends of mine who are black, in their first couple of years of driving, they were stopped multiple times, even if they were dressed smart, and they had to make sure that they had to have their wallet with them, their papers all sorted. So it's thing.
Where's that? Sorry, is that in the UK?
Yeah, that was Brighton.
Right.
So I think with it's the fact that I don't have to think about race at all in the UK, because that's the
and see, for some people, that's what forms their response. They're like, what do you mean race is an issue? I've never experienced anything like that. Well, of course you haven't. And the Christian response when people raise these concerns is really unhelpful. And sometimes the response from people who have spent a lot of time studying this issue is really unhelpful, because the particular things that they study skew their perspective. So if you get, for example, a person, and I've had this, people who are really, really interested in things like cultural Marxism and in debunking the Black Lives Matters organization and movement, which is not what I'm talking about, or critical race theory, they'll be very sensitive to these terms. And whenever you start mentioning them, we're like, oh, so you're aligning yourself with the Marxists, you're aligning yourself with the critical race theorists. No, I'm not. These concepts existed independently of these organizations and movements, and it's just really unhelpful that Christians have started to associate the two. And it's really damaging too, because when I raise a concern or just a statement or an observation about racism, and people assume that I'm on, verbally in public in front of others on Facebook, start assuming that I'm a Marxist or I'm on the left. What that means is, and what and how that will be seen by everyone else is, my culture, conservative Christianity, doesn't care about those things. If you raise those concerns, that makes you on the left. What a load of nonsense! But what a horrible way to depict the conservative Christian right.
Yeah, I've seen those threads both on your feed and even on my own, where I've talked about white privilege, and the responses are very much distractions from the topic, or denying it exists, then also worrying about the language. It is interesting to watch, but it is unhelpful, and I think it shows on my thread who's actually engaging in those conversations, and it's not anyone from the backgrounds that actually are experiencing it. and I find that actually quite worrying, that all my friends who are black, Asian, whatever minority we're talking about, they're just watching. And I've got this thread full of people who are, some of them are just really searching. They're searching for the right language to put on it. But there's this lack of listening, I guess, going on. And I'm trying to explain.
It's like a bunch of men arguing about what it's like to have a period.
I think it must look like it.
I think one way to look at it as well is that people, you have to think as well what the type of the messages that people are getting. Now, if all we mean by white privilege is that you have the privilege of not experiencing racism, I mean, that just seems self-evidently true. But I think, especially, in the countries, represented here and the US, if you're a white person, you're highly unlikely. There might be some minorities that have prejudice towards white people, but largely you're very unlikely to experience it in a way that's going to affect any, significant outcome in your life. But I think the problem is what people are reading. If the stuff that comes through on your Facebook feed and on Twitter is from people who are, perhaps more on the critical race theorist side, who are saying things, and you're thinking, well, if I admit I have white privilege, I'm admitting to these things. Someone like Robin DiAngelo and these types of people they're kind of saying that I'm just a racist, and there's nothing. And even when you say you're not a racist, well, that's actually a racist thing to say, because it's. So I think what happens, I think a more charitable approach is that criticism is rooted in the messages that they're receiving. Because I think if as I said, if all we mean by that, it's just self-evidently true. But I have other concerns. Because I know I had discussed it with Phil, and you'll be interested in this too, Glenn. Is when if you deliver. There was a psychology study done last year, I think, or maybe the year before, is that when people undergo white privilege training, what happens is that they're more likely to hold then disparaging, discriminatory views against white people who are under the poverty line. So they then hold more positive views about African Americans, which is great. But what happens, because if by being white you by default have privilege and access, you're basically an advantage, a foot up, a leg up. If you're white and you're poor, the only explanation can be is that you failed to take advantage of the advantage of your white privilege, and so you don't really deserve sympathy. And that's something that does concern me as well. Again, it's not enough to say, right, I'm not going to advantage.
It can be a fairly simplistic objection to the concept of privilege, and I hear this and this is one of the pushbacks I get too. It's like, but I was white and I was poor, ergo no white privilege. But so it's important to stress that this, number one, is not the only sort of privilege that exists. There are thousands of competing privileges and disadvantages that people face, and having one does not automatically trump all the others and enable you to overcome them. And that's part of the risk, where you become so interested in the concept of white privilege that it's the most important or the only privilege or factor in the game, and it's clearly not.